after we get it, we still might not get it. Let's talk about it with Paul Zahl on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
Hey, we're so glad you're here. I say it every time and mean it every time. You always have a place at our table. In case you're wondering, I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Matthew Porter is here. He's going on vacation soon, and that's not something you're good at. Last year, he mailed us postcards, and they read, "Wish I was there." Our producer, Jinx, is in his little glass booth. Jinx is so relaxed, I wonder if he ever needs a vacation. And
I'm on vacation every day.
Oh,
right.
That's a good place to be.
I stole that straight from the song.
Our one-man IT department is John Myers. He's in his tech bunker. We're now in what John considers shorts season, which runs from late summer through early summer.
It's Florida.
And Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. George says with temperatures soaring, now is the time to bless Key Life with some cold, hard cash. And Catherine Wyatt is the soft feminine side of the program. Kathy says today is National Conspiracy Debunking Day.
Really?
Or so they would have us think.
Really?
I don't know. I didn't write this. Matthew writes it.
Did you
And
see?
he's not a good fact checker.
Yeah,
So
not at all.
Who knows? He has a tendency to make things up.
Yeah. Did you see my mug? This is your mug. I borrowed it for today. It says all you need is Jesus and a good cup of coffee and a piece of cherry pie, because you people keep it so cold in here.
So there is or is not cherry pie?
There is no cherry pie,
But
and
there's
this isn't
coffee.
even coffee.
Well, Kathy, if
Oh.
it makes you feel any better,
And she didn't even ask me if she could use my cup.
I got
I
off
mean,
work
it's-
last night at like midnight.
No
and,
respect.
and I was working at a church, so in the attic of a church, so it was hot all day and all night. And I got home, and I'm like, finally, I'm home. And I walk in, I'm like, feels nice in here. And I just happened to look over at the little Echo Show on the countertop in the kitchen, and it says 12:04 a.m. 83 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh wow!
It's too much.
Oh, man. Short weather, I'll tell you. Hey, guys, we got a great guest today. Paul Zahl is a friend of mine, and he's also a hero of mine. He's a priest, former dean, and president of Trinity Episcopal School for Ministry. He has authored 1,000 books, including The First Christian, Who Will Deliver Us. But today we're going to talk about a book that's been out for a long time and is one of the major volumes having to do with what we're about at Key Life. As you know, we're about radical grace, and sometimes it's so radical that it's scary. In fact, a number of years ago, and this is how I discovered Dr. Zahl, I was teaching a course for a seminary in Washington on grace in the church, and there was a man who was taking the course who was a physician and, in fact, a professor at a medical school in Washington. And he was taking notes and laughing at the jokes and was buying into it. And that takes a while because what I was teaching was fairly radical. And after the first class, he said, "You know something? You're weird." And he said, "Have you ever heard of Paul Zahl?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And he said, "Well, he's weirder than you are, and I'm going to bring his book, and you're going to like it." I want you to know that I stayed up the next day he brought the book. I stayed up all night that night reading this book,
Wow.
which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, Grace and Practice, a Theology for Everyday Life. And I carry this book on my Kindle, and I check it every once in a while. So it's nice to have somebody who's weirder than I am on this broadcast, who believes in grace so much that he makes me sound like a Pharisee. And you're going to love this time with Paul Zahl. Paul, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, all of you. I'm delighted to be here. You know that.
Yeah, how this book is years old. I suspect that you had gotten into trouble for teaching these things before you wrote them. And when you wrote them, you got into some big-time trouble. Do grace teachers, if they're going to be clear about what the Bible teaches about grace, can they count on getting into trouble?
Well, they'll get into trouble theoretically because of the familiar accusation of antinomianism, and we could go into that because people will say, "Well, you're really diluting the character of Christ's clear imperatives," and which you're not doing at all. But where you really get into trouble with grace is in the practice of it, and in particular, I have to say, in the official Christian church. That's where you get the trouble. I'm traditional and I'm conservative in my view of Orthodox Christianity, but I am also keenly aware that the structure of the church, whatever denomination you choose to mention, is such that it inevitably causes a refutation of grace in the way it treats, especially clergy.
Mm.
And one of the things I learned very early on, that the most controversial element of this was that I came up against a incredibly harsh treatment of clergy that the denominations had. It was as if someone once said about the Navigators, someone who was very involved in an organization called the Navigators, that he said, well, like every Christian organization that preaches grace, the closer you get to the innermost center of the organization, the more law you find.
Oh, man.
And I discovered in the Episcopal Church that the degree of harsh judgment against clergy and ministers who had fallen, no more than the woman taken in adultery or the various other people you can think of, that the degree of the lack of grace in the innermost workings of institutional Christianity was really despairing. Now, I'm not in despair. I mean, I still enjoy prayer book worship. I still enjoy the history of the church. And I'm like the Orioles, the group that sang in the 1950s, Crying in the Chapel. Remember that song? Mm-hmm. It's in American Graffiti, the movie. Richard Dreyfuss wants to talk to the DJ, played by Wolfman Jack, but the music is Crying in the Chapel, because for him, the chapel is where Wolfman Jack is. So I identify with a place. I love a place where there can be, but I'm really quite despondent about the ability of the Episcopal Church or the PCA or any number of churches, the Roman Catholic Church, to really live out grace. And it's a terrible, terrible wound in the cause of Christ today.
You don't make a lot of friends in the establishment with those kinds of comments, do you? In fact, you paid a price for them.
Well, what they do is, and again, what they do is they exempt certain kinds of sin from grace. Every generation does this. I mean, people did it. You do it with sex in one generation. You do it with certain kind of terms or speech in another generation, or you do it with certain political taboos in another generation, or you do it with child rearing in another generation. It's a moving target. But the great issue with grace is, are you willing to apply it to where it really counts? And the answer is usually de facto no. I'm not willing to do grace where it really counts. And that's preoccupied me. I'm a little beyond it now. I'm not losing sleep over it, but I've noticed that every organization, didn't somebody once say that every organization humanly ends up being the opposite of what it started out to be? And so I'm very concerned that the visible church retain a sense of grace where it is most costly. I don't have illusions, but that is absolutely crucial for the long future of our movement.
Oh, man. And by the way, Paul's not going to talk about, but he's paid a big price for this too. I mean, he has been a target of a lot of people who are angry at him. And when I first met him, that was going on pretty heavy. And he has propagated this in his family. If you want to go to a great website, and Paul sometimes writes for this website, it is Mockingbird. Just Google Mockingbird, and then you'll find the link to it. Then go to it and batten down the hatches, because there is such good stuff from Paul's son at Mockingbird. Yeah, I think it's mockingbird.org or .com or one of those things. But you can find it unless you're an idiot. Hey, we're gonna come back like Jesus, and it's our fond hope you will too. Thanks for joining us. We're talking to author Paul Zahl about his classic book, and you got to get this book. This should be in your library, and it'll be a book you'll read. It doesn't pull any punches. It's very real, and it's foundational. And a lot of our listeners and viewers are just now learning how radical, scandalous grace is. And if you're just beginning this walk, this book should be in your library. I hold it in my nicotine-stained fingers. It's Grace in Practice, a theology of everyday life.
Paul, I have like a dozen different questions about grace sketched down that I'd love to get into, but then we were talking during the break, and you mentioned something about finding grace in pop culture. And then you mentioned the Carpenters, and that's a little dangly bit of yarn for me that, it's very interesting. I wondered if you could just talk about that a little bit, because love the Carpenters, big fan of pop culture.
Well, in order to make popular culture come alive in the Christian church or in preaching, you have to love it yourself. You're not using it as a kind of pretext. And obviously you do, Matthew. And one of the things that I've loved since I was a little boy is some unusual moments in popular culture that happen to touch me, that I happen to respond to. And if I can present to people I'm speaking to my own heartfelt interest in a particular piece of music, it inevitably makes contact. And I'll give you two examples. When I first started out in an Episcopal church in South Carolina, which was a very traditional church in many ways, I opened my first sermon by singing a song from the pop hit, Please Come to Boston, which was at that time a big, please come to Boston in the summer. And it's an extraordinary song about love. It's about the grace of a woman back in, I'm the number one fan of the man from Tennessee. It's about a man in Tennessee, a woman, I should say, whose love for this ridiculous, fragile, erratic guy is willing to stand and never deviate. And I sang this song, just a verse of it. And two guys in the church who were real good old boys came up afterwards and they said, Mr. Zahl, if this is the kind of sermon you're going to preach, we volunteer right now to become the head of the youth group, because they were good old boys who were going to attract young men because they were fishermen and hunters, and they were wildly attractive guys. And our entire youth ministry goes back to please come to Boston in the summer. Now, recently, I'm finding extraordinary interest in the song by Karen and Richard Carpenter that they did in the late 70s. And it became #1 in Ireland. It was number 62 in America. So it's late Carpenters, right? It's after, Sing and all those. But it's called Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft. And it's #1 it's a UFO song, but it is so powerful. And it was produced by the same team that did the Moody Blues, Days of Future Past. And it is so lyrical and so powerful. It's not particularly graceful, but it is cool in the extreme. And everywhere I go, all I need to do is play one verse of Karen Carpenter trying to contact UFOs with her extraordinary lyrical, fragile voice. Yes. And I have the entire congregation of 2,000 Asbury Seminary Revival people eating out of one's hand because I love it so much. So what I'm really saying, if something speaks to your heart, that's always grace. If it speaks to your heart, then share it. So that was my little thought. Thank you, Matthew.
Yes.
Oh,
wow.
Absolutely.
Gosh.
I got to go find that song.
Well, let me
He's
give you one
always,
other
every
example.
time I've talked to Paul, he's recommended books, and I've read every one he's ever recommended to me. And now I got to go listen to music too. Thanks a lot.
Well, let me just give you one other example. We all know about Les Mis and what a wonderful musical that is. But Les Mis, although Victor Hugo was rather anti-ecclesiastical, perhaps to an extent because of his history with the French Revolution, and you can forgive him that. Nevertheless, the encounter of Jean Valjean, the released convict, with the bishop at the beginning of his novel, Les Miserables, has got to be one of the most graceful moments in the history of literature. And let me add one thing to it. People don't realize, they think, well, the bishop imputes to the man who stole his candlesticks innocence, and the man who stole his candlesticks is released by the police. But what they don't realize is that Hugo carries it one step further, because after Valjean has been incredibly moved by this imputation of innocence to his guilty heart, he does it one more time. He goes out into a field where he's trying to get a nap after this extraordinary experience, and he robs a little shepherd boy of the little bit of change that the poor shepherd boy actually has. And he robs the boy, and the boy runs away, screaming and shouting and crying. In other words, he does it again. And that's when the grace of God enters. Because when Jean Valjean realizes that he's done it again, even after having been forgiven so powerfully by the bishop, he falls on his knees and he is truly converted. And I just wanted to underline that. That is pure grace, because it realizes that we are going to do it again. But when Christ forgives us again, oh my gosh.
Oh, man, that is so good. The prodigal son went back to the pig farm. They don't tell you that in the gospel, but he did. If I'd been there, I would have said, son, you're going to go back. Just remember the taste of the wine and the sound of the laughter so you can come back again and again and again.
Paul, I thought we'd jump right into semi-Pelagianism, but maybe just for some foundational things, maybe it would make sense to just sort of contrast grace and law and the importance of the law.
And we might have to put this over. You start, and then we'll finish with a theological lecture on the other side of the break.
Well, just in a trice, law and grace are getting at the same thing, which is a redeemed and free life, which is free to love spontaneously and extemporaneously and hugely from the heart. But law, i.e. admonition, never has the ability to create the very thing it demands. The only thing that can demand works of love, to quote Kierkegaard, is previous or prior love, to quote Stevie Winwood. And what this means is that the reason law is bad is not because it's bad, is because it is, as the French say, inutile. It doesn't work.
Boy, it doesn't. I'm still trying.
You almost got
I'm
it.
going to stay with it. I've gotten close a couple of times and thought, now Jesus will love me. And I keep working at it and being religious and going to church and doing works of mercy and kindness. And then I slip and cuss and spit and hurt somebody, and I go back to zero. And then Jesus always says, "You through?" And when I say, "Yeah," then I begin to understand grace. Hey guys, we're talking to Paul Zahl. What a gift to all of us. The book is Grace in Practice, a theology for everyday life. Don't you go anywhere. Hey, we're so glad that you're spending this time with us. That's a high and holy compliment, and we see it as that. We're hanging out with Paul Zahl, incredible scholar who has this ability to take some heavy, difficult to understand, complicated stuff and getting the fodder down to a place where normal people can understand. By the way, you can follow him on Twitter at Zahl, and that's Zahl Paul, Zahl Paul. Any other websites we ought to be familiar with, Paul?
Isn't there the southern
I
one,
do a
the Zahl
Tumblr
Paul
blog,
y'all?
I do a Tumblr blog called The Protestant Face of Anglicanism, which is more to do with architecture and liturgy and some historic questions relating to the Episcopal tradition. But I do a lot of fun with the visuals there.
Oh, man, so good.
Paul,
and I do a podcast called PZ's Podcast for Mockingbird, for the record.
Okay.
Excellent.
Good. Paul, you just started unpacking the idea of sort of needing to understand law and our relationship to it, especially given our nature as humans, in terms of really understanding grace. Can you pick up on that and keep moving on that?
Yes, I will try. You can look at the whole history of the Bible, and you don't want to be facile or really, you want to make sure you're speaking accurately. But the entire history of the Bible is a kind of way that God approaches the human race by believing or somehow giving the impression that if you tell people what to do for their own good, they will do it. And human nature is such that is that doesn't work. And so the entire history of the Bible is of a circular and repetitive, in the Old Testament that is, circular or repetitive narrative of failure for people to do what they're supposed to do, just like your teenage son or your teenage daughter or somebody you know who's a fentanyl addict. It is a repetitive, despondent, suicidal repetition of inability that is doubled by criticism. And we see this in life all the time. The only way you're going to fail with your husband or your wife or your teenage child or anybody you know with getting them to do what they ought to do, getting them to fly right, is to tell them what to do. It's a strange and odd thing, but it's just the way it is. And the story of the Bible is God, so to speak, understanding or coming to some providential, highly mystically Trinitarian understanding that human beings have to be treated differently. And that the only way that change to actually become the people that God wants us to be is through mercy and forgiveness and a redoubled acceptance of sin, which is not acceptance, but is forgiveness. And this sounds like a cliche, but it's the essence of the Christian faith at its heart. You can see it brilliantly embodied in a play from the 1920s, late 20s, called The Green Pastures, which is an African-American approach to the history of the Bible from the creation to the present day in terms of African-American spirituality. And while today we look at it as having a lot of cliches and images that we see as sort of Uncle Tomish, once you get to the heart of this brilliant play that is an African-American incarnation of the history of the world, God discovers mercy at the end of the Old Testament in a very odd and unusual, funny way, and he changes the entire rules of order at the end of Green Pastures, which was made into a very good movie, by the way. And he suddenly realizes that he's going to deal with these impossible recalcitrant people by means of mercy. And it is, you see it and you just can't even believe it's there, but it's the essence of what saved your marriage. I mean, it's the essence of what made it possible for you to have a relationship with your child who's gone a million miles from you for whatever reason. And I would say that the biblical story is not a story about ontology or being. It's a story about the dynamics of relating to people in such a way that they can respond to love. That may sound simplistic, but I see it in every friendship I have. I see it in every troubling impasse interpersonally I encounter. And the way forward is always assimilation of the negativity and therefore the ability to forgive rather than to criticize and to straighten out. So that's what I've tried to talk about over the years.
Oh man, I don't know where we lost it. I think it's always been there. Green Pastures is an example of that. God said, "I'm lonely, I'll make me a world," and then wow, what happens is absolutely amazing. We're talking with Paul Zahl. As I told you, you can follow him on Twitter at Zahl Paul. And you can go to Mockingbird. There's a podcast there. And if you Google his name, you'll find all kinds of neat stuff that is life-changing, that'll make a difference. And we are privileged to have him with us. The book is an old book, but it should be in your library. Grace and Practice, a theology for everyday life. And Paul has promised me that if you go out and buy it, you'll get 3 free sins. Hey, we're glad you're a part of this program today. One of the truly great ones. By the way, if you use the YouVersion Bible Study app, we have a brand new Key Life devotional you can check out there. It's called Laughter and Lament, and you can get the details, of course, at keylife.org/devotional.
Paul, Steve has an illustration that he's used for years and years and years about a friend who was with his grandchild, and she did something, and he said, "Don't do that anymore." And she said, "I'm sorry." And then it happened again, and had it happen kind of repetitively. And after the third or fourth time, he said to her, "Honey, I told you not to do that." And she said, "Again, I'm sorry." And he said to her, "I'm sorry is not enough." And then he very distinctly heard the voice of Jesus saying to him something along the lines of, "Funny, it was enough for me." I play that in my head more frequently than I would like to admit, because there is something about it. And it was interesting to me that in the very first segment you mentioned about how in every generation there are things that are just so horrible as far as the church is concerned. And I feel like it's so easily impressed upon us in the church that there are these things. Nobody ever comes out and says that's unforgivable, but there's this strong emphasis on things that are worse than other things. And, and the reminder is that, when I have my own stuff, just like we all do. And when I can get my head out of the sand and remind myself of my own stuff, then all of a sudden this idea of grace becomes, so much easier. But then it gets buried in the sand again so quickly. And I don't understand why it's so easy. Well, I do. It's sin nature. But, it just seems like it's so easy for us to forget and start pointing the finger again and totally forgetting about the degree to which we are forgiven ourselves, and why we forget that in the church. I don't understand.
Well, it's
Except I do.
You put your finger on the pulse or on the wound of the greatest issue in grace, and that is, does grace extend to the worst thing, or does it only extend to the penultimate things? And in my experience, everybody has a worst thing. I don't necessarily mean a horrible predatory sin, but everybody has something in their life, in my experience. Maybe there are exceptions, but I haven't. Maybe Barbara Streisand is an exception, because I feel she's almost
She
perfect
thinks
in
she
music.
is.
But almost everybody I know has something in themselves where they cannot bring grace. They've just given up. It's a repeated temper. It's a dream, a daydream that you have that's violent. It's something that happened to you 40 years ago that you cannot seem to get over, and is as present to you today as it was when it happened. And people can talk you out of it a million times, but it still doesn't leave you, or some pattern that you cannot resist. And the greatest challenge pastorally is to exercise grace to that area of deepest hurt and scar in you. And what the church does, it will take one thing that is the absolute worst thing you can do. In the Church of England right now, it's any kind of abuse to a minor, and it's a terrible thing, abuse to a minor. But recently, someone has committed suicide who did a bad thing, but the church said, oh, well, he did a bad thing, so forget about the suicide. And an archbishop has been deposed because he didn't handle it exactly right when he heard 3 times removed that this clergyman had done a bad thing, which he certainly shouldn't have done. But it's as if that one area has meant, and not only is it unforgivable, and it caused the suicide of the bad man, but it's on anybody who even touched it, including the Archbishop of York, who's a brilliant black jurist, has been deposed over a 3rd step. So what I'm saying there, that's a heavy thing, but each of us has a moment like that. There's not a single one who I'm looking at here who doesn't have something. It doesn't have to be that, but a defeat, some sort of defeat that has proved impregnable to God's assimilation and a perspective of mercy. And so my great pastoral concern, especially in sermons and teaching, is try to show people the hope of compassion, mercy, and forgiveness in the one area which they have psychodynamically exempted from the power of God.
Mm-hmm. But big question, and tagging on to that, let's say that through God's grace, we are be able to bring forgiveness to every single moment that this is repeated. Okay. Does forgiveness come hand in hand with an all-access pass for them back in our lives? Is there a separation between those two? If we forgive somebody repeatedly, do they still get the same access into our lives? Is that part and parcel with forgiveness?
Well, that's a very good question.
It's a huge.
My
I get it.
instinctive human answer is no. I mean, I have people, don't you, who've been terrible to me in one sense or another, who I've forgiven in my belief, really have honestly forgiven, but I do not necessarily have to see them ever again. I'll say to Mary, well, so and so, as far as I'm concerned, I never need to see that person again. But in fact, that's probably not the whole deal. And you would, obviously Judas Iscariot, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we probably have to say that for grace to be complete, it has to include the ability of the bandaged, forgiven sinner to once again connect with you. But I say that trepidatiously, Matthew, trepidatiously.
Oh, man.
Thank you.
Paul, I was going to ask you to read one of the things you had written recently, and we're out of time.
Well,
we got to have you back on several times and
Yeah,
talk
we
about
do.
this again.
We need to
was
do it again.
so good. Paul, you got a closing word, an admonishment, a statement that we'll remember the rest of our lives?
Well, this, that's easy. I am going to read one thing and leave it. It's very short. God's grace makes a second chance always possible. There is no condition or situation in life for which this is not true.
Wow.
Oh, man.
Wow.
I'll live on that the rest of this day. Paul, you have for so many years made a difference, and you continue to do that in thousands of lives, and I'm one of them. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for spending this much time with us on this program. As always, you're a delight. Now, Paul, don't go to singles bars, okay? And try not to get drunk. And don't hit somebody. It would just hurt your witness. I just want you to, guys.
Where did that come
I'm
from?
filling time. I
Well,
got 10 seconds.
He just wanted to
and I
outline the
gotta-
rules of their relationship.
Gotta go. You guys, we'll come back and tell you who's going to be here next week. Hey, what a great hour. Spending time with Paul Zahl is always that. He is so profound and so deep sometimes you got to listen to get what he's saying. And he says it so well. And it's something we all remember. I loved what he said at the end, that everybody, as a response to Kathy's question, he said everybody's got something inside that's a horrible thing. And when you talk about grace, Jesus always says, yes, that too. Yes, that too. And sometimes we forget that because there are sometimes that the that to's are places we can't forgive ourselves. And certainly when others did that too, it's very, very hard to forgive them. But that's what this is about, guys. It's not about religion. It's not about ritual. It's not about systematic theology. When you get down to the hard core of it, and the reason that Jesus came, because it's about that too. And we must never forget, and we need to remind each other, because we all have that too in our lives, and we need to remind ourselves, maybe just say to a friend, yes, that's too. That too. It'll blow them away. But anyway, Paul Zahl is about as radical as you can get on the subject. And sometimes I say when I listen to him, I don't believe I would have said that. I'd have left that part out, but he never leaves anything out. And that's why the book is called A Theology for Everyday Life. That includes everything. Kathy, who's going to be on next week?
am really excited to announce this one, and I will seriously be looking for a raise after this because I have absolutely cornered the market. Next week is us.
Just
How did
Just
you book
us.
them?
Listen, it was not easy. I can get big names easier
They're
than I can
huge
get
right now.
all of us at the same time. We get some great response from our listeners and watchers when we just sit around and talk about stuff. And so I have no earthly idea what we're going to talk about, but it's going to be us. And we really are quite fun and very brilliant.
Oh, yeah.
Very
you don't want
exciting.
to miss.
And you
I'm a
don't
big
want to miss
fan.
it if you can watch
good
it on
looking.
TV because, I mean, after all,
Because we're handsome and beautiful, too.
there you go.
Hey, you guys, join us next week, same time, same place. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't do, and that gives you a wide, wide berth.
I hope they don't cancel.
Nice, break there.